Ever since Captain John Meares touched down at Nootka Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island, Canada has been plagued with Asian discrimination. In the hopes of establishing a trading post, the British fur trader brought along with him 50 Chinese artisans, an event which marks the first recorded Asian person to step foot on Canadian soil. That was in May of 1788, almost 250 years ago. Ever since that day, Asian immigration into Canada became commonplace, with many Chinese workers coming to Canada to aid the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Of course, this was met with backlash. In an attempt to prevent more and more Asian immigrants, legislations like the Chinese Immigration Act started to arise in 1885. This includes imposing a head tax on each Chinese person who wants to immigrate into Canada, and the continuous journey regulation, which was established in 1908, which prohibited immigrants from entering Canada if they did not make one continuous journey from their country of origin. All this and much more in an attempt to dissuade Asians from coming into Canada in order to protect the ideology and sanctity of a white man's country. As these cheap tactics began to garner public backlash, the government turned to disease as a valid reason to discriminate against Asian Canadians. But what does disease have to do with discrimination? And what does it have to do with Asian Canadian discrimination today? Well, let's start with the basics. What is disease? According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a disease is a sickness or an instance of sickness, a condition in which the function and often also the structure of the body or part of body is disturbed or impaired. And while there isn't conclusive evidence on which disease was the first ever, it is known that disease and sickness have plagued humankind ever since its inception. So the question remains, how did disease turn into a tool of discrimination against Asians in Canada? Well, for the Canadian government, they turned to the only way they knew how: policies. The 1869 Immigration Act prohibited any immigrant with disability or mental illness. In 1902, immigrant prohibition included anyone suffering from any loathsome, dangerous, or infectious disease or malady. In 1906, the Immigration Act prohibited any immigrant with a disability, mental illness, or epilepsy, the deaf or blind, and anyone afflicted with loathsome disease or with a disease that is contagious or infectious and which may become dangerous to public health. And in 1952, the Immigration Act prohibited the following: any immigrant with a disability, mental illness, or epilepsy, any diseased person, which included tuberculosis, trachoma, or any contagious or infectious disease, or any disease that may become dangerous to public health, people with alcohol or other drug addictions, people medically certified as impaired, and people who mentally or physically cannot earn a living. Even today, Canadian immigration has certain requirements when it comes to disease and immigration. Under the Immigration and Citizenship page on the Government of Canada website, they state that they can deny entry to Canada for medical reasons that include medical conditions that endanger public health, endanger public safety, or causes excessive demand on health or social services. While these policies may seem reasonable to some and at most ableist to others, it is how the government leveraged these policies that made it racially discriminatory. From 1912 to 1914, Canadian officials commenced non-standard health testing for South Asian arrivals and only South Asian arrivals. More specifically, they were testing for hookworms, a curable intestinal parasite that causes anemia, loss of energy and appetite, and was transmissible through contact with stool. This came after U.S. public health officials discovered that many South Asians stationed in a quarantine facility in California had hookworms. The U.S. then implemented these tests with great success, barring hundreds of South Asians at the U.S. ports. After catching word of the U.S.'s triumph, medical examiners in Vancouver and Victoria were told to secretly test for hookworms for upcoming South Asian arrivals, and once again, only South Asian arrivals. A quote from the Immigration Department inspector at the time states, The more I consider the question of Asian immigration to this coast, the more I'm convinced that the only effective restriction would be obtained through examination for hookworm disease. If we were to proceed on these lines and we were able to reject 90% of these people, the object of the government would be obtained. The rejection of immigrants under this cause would not be followed by so much criticism by the general public. In fact, on the other hand, it would appeal to them strongly as a measure for the protection of public health. While the Canadian Immigration Act at the time didn't explicitly classify the hookworm disease as contagious or loathsome, they still tested for it, with the Deputy Minister of the Interior at the time stating that it was important that this matter should be kept private. A more recent example of the Canadian government using disease to racially discriminate against Asian Canadians would be that of Juana Tejada, a Filipino woman. She had immigrated to Canada through the Live-In Caregiver Program, a program which granted permanent residency to domestic workers who worked for at least 2 years. After 2 years of working as a nanny and an application, her bid for permanent residency was denied. Why was it denied, you ask? Well, in a second health screening, it was revealed that she had developed colon cancer while working as a nanny. It took 2 years of appeals, fighting, and ultimately advocacy in order for her to finally get her permanent residency. Many support groups formed in her name, with other caregivers with health issues coming out to seek support. Unfortunately, she passed away a couple months later, fighting for caregivers' rights. Ultimately, she won, and in April 2010, the Juana Tejada Law was passed. This law was an amendment to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act that annuls the need for a second medical exam when foreign caregivers apply for permanent residency. Although this next one isn't necessarily a disease, it's still a prevalent case, and sometimes occurs even today. This is known as the Chinese restaurant syndrome. This syndrome has been rampant ever since a letter written by Dr. Robert Ho Man Kwok was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1968. The letter stated that they had symptoms of illness after eating Chinese food and stated that it could be the MSG. This single letter sparked many research studies on MSG and what it does to the physiology of humans after consuming. Many of these studies conveniently contradict each other. While there isn't a large case of this happening specifically in Canada, as an Asian Canadian myself, I definitely observed a stigma around Chinese food and it being dirty due to these claims. While these examples seem like they happened ages ago, Asian discrimination can still unfortunately be linked with disease to this day. Coronavirus disease 2019. The elephant in the room. Better known as COVID-19, this disease has plagued the world for almost 4 years now, ever since December of 2019. According to the World Health Organization, this deadly disease has claimed just under 7 million victims globally as of December 6th, 2023, and due to its origins in Wuhan, China, people of Asian descent from all over the world have faced scrutiny. Of course, Canadians were no different, once again turning to discrimination. A study conducted by Canadian Psychology finds that over a third of this 874 Chinese Canadian respondents reported that they had personally been threatened or intimidated, and over half reported that they have been treated with less respect. And that's just one study. There are countless studies that find similar trends. As a Chinese Canadian, the first time I received racial hostility was after the outbreak of COVID-19. To combat this, Asians across the world once again turned to activism, with protests headlined by the slogan, "Stop Asian Hate." While racial discrimination against Asian Canadians have started to settle down once again, and the circumstances have certainly gotten much better, it's still important to increase the level of education. I personally went through every stage of the schooling system here in BC, and not once do I recall learning about Asian Canadian history, let alone the topic of discrimination against Asian Canadians and linking that with disease and illness. Patterns like these always remind me of a quote from George Santayana, a Spanish American philosopher. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Thank you.